Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's program. Today, my guest is esteemed researcher, author, speaker, as seen on the History and Science channels, and author of the book The Forgotten Exodus, The Into Africa Theory of Human Evolution. My guest today is Mr. Bruce Fenton. Bruce, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Justin. Thank you for inviting me on. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. I just want to get right into some of this stuff because I'm sure all my listeners know who you are. They know your background and how you got started. So the first thing I want to ask you is the out of Australia or into Africa theory. I know those two are a little bit different. So
Yeah.
can you just do our audience a favor and just give us a brief rundown of that theory?
Yeah, basically, if we go to the root of the human story, it's accepted that the first hominins, which are, again, hominins are humans, but it includes the early archaic humans, such as Denisovans, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and even earlier to the Australopithecines. These all come under the hominin sort of grouping. Now, that these hominins all emerged in Africa, and then way later on, around 2 million years ago, that we have some of them, Homo erectus, that leave Africa, and that they go on to evolve into Neanderthals and Denisovans. Whereas in Africa, a group that remains in place eventually becomes the first Homo sapiens, somewhere around about, now there's some disagreement on this, but somewhere around about 700,000 years ago or so, the line diverges from what is probably Homo erectus towards ancestral Homo sapiens. And that much later, again, somewhere around 300,000 years ago, some of these early Homo sapiens begin to flow out of Africa. They supposedly unsuccessful, they die off. And then there is a later wave, perhaps 120,000 years ago, which again are sort of unsuccessful. And at last, somewhere around 50 to 70,000 years ago, there's fully modern, by this point, fully modern humans have arisen in Africa, and that they now move out into the rest of the world, replacing the archaic hominins that were already there. Now, that's essentially the greater out of Africa theory. Now, within that, there's other smaller theories, you might say, sort of sub theories, such as recent out of Africa, which focuses specifically on the sort of modern human story and how we ended up being throughout Eurasia, America, Australia, etc. So that's a more specific subtopic.
So that's supposed to be that more recent date that you're talking about is right around 55,000 to 60,000 years ago. That's what we're focusing on
Mhm.
here. All right. So,
Yes, so
yeah.
we'll be tackling more the later modern human story rather than necessarily the flow of archaic humans. But I should add that I disagree with some of the earlier story as well, in that rather than accepting that Homo sapiens emerged from a line of Homo erectus in Africa, I think it's far more likely that they actually emerged from Homo erectus outside of Africa, that were already out of Africa around 2 million years ago. Indeed, it may even been a different hominin entirely. But as it stands, it looks to me that we should probably be revising the story as far back as 2 million years ago, just so that to clarify that.
Absolutely. And we will talk a little bit more about Homo
Mhm.
erectus and some of the multi-regional emergence stuff later
Mhm.
on.
Sure.
But the first thing I want to ask you is, what was some of the main evidence that led you down this path? Like, what was there like some
Mhm.
discovery that made you go, oh wow, a light bulb went up in your head and made you go down this path of inquiry?
Yeah, absolutely there was. I mean, I was schooled in the consensus hypothesis, as everyone essentially is, more or less, unless you have a very, say, religious view. Everyone else comes to believe that, that we have an African story, that, we came out of Africa, say, 60,000 years ago, give or take, say, 10,000. And that after that, there's this, gradual spread across Eurasia, which ends with Australia and then America, right? So that I was familiar with that, and that was what I believed to be true for almost, most of my life.
Right.
Um, and indeed, I'm of recent African descent. My My mother's side of the family were, from slaves taken to the Caribbean. So I had some level of personal, I suppose you say sort of personal pride in the fact that, as a partly African person, that, Africans were at the root of this modern human story. So, I mean, I certainly, if any sort of bias was there, I had a bias towards that narrative. So it actually took quite a strange flow of events to change my thinking. Back in 2012, I'd moved to Ecuador, and whilst there, I became involved in investigating a megalithic site in the Yanganatis National Park, which is a large area of swampy jungles in the eastern part of Ecuador, which connects on to the main Amazon jungle. It's part of the Amazon jungle. Now, within there is a strange, huge megalithic wall, part of a construction that really doesn't fit well with any known cultures. There's, for example, there's mortar on it, which the Aztecs didn't use mortar in between their blocks. The block style is reminiscent of some of the structures in Peru with these polygonal, large megalithic blocks. So again, there may be some links, but the site itself is in an area that wouldn't have been habitable in, I'm guessing it could go back, let's say, well beyond 5,000 years, maybe to that 12,000. So when we had severe global changes underway, it may have been, I think, around that time that a lot of this jungle didn't actually exist. And we sometimes think of the Amazon jungle as being timeless, but that's not really true. And there were points where large areas of it were actually savannas and stuff, right? So I'm of the opinion that the structure would have likely been built before the jungle was there. Because, I mean, it's not a hospitable area. I mean, there's swamps and, say, the extreme temperatures and all sorts of reasons why you wouldn't really want to build a big megalithic sort of site in the jungle there. So I started looking a bit more into this. I thought, well, who could it be? And really, the first connections I came to was that not far from there's a cave site where they uncovered the remains of some early Stone Age humans that are called the Lagoa Santa type people. Now, the Lagoa Santa are best known from Brazil, where there's actually a site, Lagoa Santa.
Right.
Because who may go back well beyond 20,000 years. I mean, there's dates at some sites down in Brazil that suggest 30, 40, maybe 50,000 years of inhabitation by these people. Now, they have a particular morphology which suggests that they are not Asiatic, that they're actually more closely related to Aboriginals and the Oceanian Aboriginal peoples, which of course is surprising, because you wouldn't have expected to find Aboriginal type people very early in Brazil.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Was were these people, did they have that Denisovan Melanesian genetic marker? And if they did, then what are some of the hypotheses out there of how they got there?
Yeah, it does seem that there's a connection there because, of course, it's in Brazil, in the Amazon, that we find tribes today that are carrying this unique signature of a lost sort of Aboriginal population, an Oceanian type population.
Right.
That this is, I think there's at least two tribes that have a significant, amount of DNA that has linked them to Oceania. And there are some other populations, I think even in Mexico and elsewhere in Peru, where there are some traces of this DNA that it may be, that there's not just these two tribes that have it, but certainly there's an anomaly there. And obviously when you've got Aboriginal type people's remains in Brazil and you've got today modern tribes, isolated tribes who carry a signature of Aboriginal people, it goes together very well, right? So we not only that, and in fact, if you look closely at the tribes that we're dealing with here, and I'm trying to remember the names, but it's gone from my mind for a moment. But one of them, they have a particular cultural overlap in that when they look to the sky, they see in the middle of the Milky Way, what we call the dark rift of the Milky Way, right? They see in that this huge flightless bird that lives, in their region, right? Which I'm not sure I can get the right name for this, but it's basically equivalent, it's a relative of the emu.
Yes.
Now, if you go to Australia and you ask the tribes what they see, many of the tribes there see a giant emu stretched along the dark rift of the Milky Way, right? So what are the chances that you are going to find not only a genetic signature of Aboriginal people, but traces of the same cultural thinking, right down to looking at the Dark Rift and seeing this giant emu stretched along, right?
Very
So
small chances.
very small
Yeah.
chances. And now, of course, we have these Lagoa Santa remains as well. So the case is becoming, I would say, overwhelmingly strong to the reasonable person that we have a very early migration that goes into the Americas from Oceania. Now, whether that's along the ice from perhaps Tasmania, along the sea ice and into Tierra del Fuego and up into South America, or whether that went round the top, and they moved up out of northern Sahel, which is, the greater Australasian region before the sea level rises, that whether they moved out of there and, of course, took the Beringia route, but very early, 50,000 years ago. That's possible, but I have to admit, I lean towards the sea ice model. I think that we probably had people that took advantage of the resources along the ice, and we know even today, of course, there are cultures that specialize in, the resources you find on the ice, marine resources, utilizing, ice structures, that you can live on it. Although to us it sounds like, horrifically hard life. There's points when that may have actually been very beneficial, particularly in the ice ages when, snow and ice was moving into your territory. You may have become very acclimatized, and so it wasn't so hard to flow further south, end up on the ice and moving along, following, whatever game was there. Now, I'm not an expert on the life there. I assume there's, things like walruses and, obviously fish and whatnot that you can exploit these resources. Move along the ice and end up in Tierra del Fuego eventually. And funnily enough, in Tierra del Fuego, the early tribes that were there, when they were first encountered, they actually have a number of overlaps again in terms of culture. There's a number of rituals that they have where they dress up, mark the body, and wear particular hats, these sort of T-shaped hats, which again you find among cultures in Aboriginal Australia. And these are the same T-shaped looking structures as you see at Göbekli Tepe, for example. These are T-shaped blocks. Right. You actually have these on their hats. They'd have on top of their head a huge T-shape. Now, again, very strange to find the same hat being used by Aboriginal Australians as people in Tierra del Fuego. On top of that, the language of the people there, it's reported, in fact, by Charles Darwin when he stopped in that region, that the people there had a very strange guttural language of we said animal noises and whistles and stuff, which sounds an awful like a click-based language, right? Which has whistles, clicks, other animal sounds. And you find that also in two other places, Aboriginal Australia and, of course, in sub-equatorial Africa, right? So, but it's very, it's funny to find that you have, again, these overlaps. So there's a good reason to suspect that we have an entry from the south into the Americas by these people. They then spread, upwards. And so Ecuador would have been very late on in that story. But I suspect that what we had is a group of these people moving up into the region, which is basically the sort of central Ecuador. There's an area they called, I'm trying to think the name of the nearest town, but essentially, anyway, there's a small town near to this site, right, where there's other finds of these people. Up in the mountains in the area, you've got Baños de Agua Santa, if people want to look up. Essentially, in that town, there's a few museums and there's even a couple of the hotels. They have collections of bones on display, which have been found in cave sites in the town, and they're labelled as Lagoa Santa type people. So we know the Lagoa Santa type people were in the area. And as I say, there was a cave site near to the megalithic structure, which contained remains from these people. So again, if you follow the dots, you think, well, who are these mysterious builders? There's a very high chance that it was Lagoa Santa. Now, that is what led me into their story and to begin researching, how could Aboriginal people end up being the first colonizers of the Americas, perhaps 50,000 years ago? And how does that fit with the recent Out of Africa story? Because I couldn't see how it did.
Right. And so you think the Aboriginal people showed up at Tierra del Fuego right around 50,000 years ago in the wake of this third migration? That's part of your theory, you would say?
Yeah, because if you think about it, we know there's a migration underway around that time. That's absolutely accepted. We know there's a movement of people throughout Eurasia. Obviously, the usual starting point is considered to be East Africa. But one thing I can certainly agree on with everyone else is that we know people are, moving at that time. So it's funny that that's when we find the first traces of early modern humans, down in South America, is
Right.
coinciding with this time of early, migrations of completely, behaviorally, culturally modern humans.
And so the cause of this migration would be something akin to the Lake Toba eruption and some climate shifts. Is that like the central event that spurned this third migration? Because part of your theory is there are these three migrations that you talk about. One 200,000 years ago, one 74,000 years ago, and the last one 60,000 years ago. And the last two are directly the result of this Lake Toba eruption. Am I correct on that?
Yes, I mean, I would modify some of my thoughts that are in the book, just
Okay.
to say, I would update that a little bit. Now, where rather than needing necessarily the earlier migration at 200,000 years ago, I think that what we probably had is from around about, very early on, I think from probably around 700,000 years ago, we have a loosely flung population of very archaic ancestors of modern humans spread all the way between Africa and Australia, throughout
Is this the
certainly the
pre
southern part
L3
of the Eurasian
lineage?
continent.
Is
Sorry?
this is this the pre? I'm sorry. Is this the pre L3 haplogroup lineage that you talk
Yeah,
about?
this would be much earlier. So these would probably be, L0 people.
Oh
And
wow. Okay.
this is going back to the first branch that splits away from assumably Homo erectus. Now, there's some debate there. Some people
Right.
suspect it may have been an Australopithecine type hominin, but basically that we know that there was a split around about 750,000 years ago ish, which begins the lineages which will lead to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. Right? We don't know for sure what the ancestral group is, but we can, let's say. We'll call it Homo erectus.
Right.
But at that point, I think we have, soon after that, we find remains in the Philippines of someone using tools there, which suggests boat, right, or watercraft. That's a recent find. We know that somebody was in Flores. We know that there's tools there going back to up to a million years. We know people are moving around in the Southeast Asian, island regions, right, around this time. We also know that there is, the genetics pointing to a split is underway, the diversification of new populations, large-brained hominins. And I would say that what we likely have here, and if we go from my own model, is that we have a movement out of Australasia. We have hominins that have entered the region a million years ago, evidenced by these tools in Flores, and that they would have inevitably made their way to Australia, because once you cross Wallace's line, which is obviously the geological
Yes.
barrier between
I was going to
certain
ask you about
ancient
that.
Asia. Yeah, it was important to highlight to people because it was always understood that the Wallace's line was essentially a near impenetrable barrier for large mammals, and that it separated the indigenous life of Australasia from that of mainland Asia. Now, very few creatures crossed that barrier.
Yes.
Rats and a few small animals. Obviously, birds and whatnot can cross, but
Yeah.
most could, because there's intensely strong currents that flow through the Indonesian islands, right, which move to the southwest, and they would just carry you out into the Indian Ocean. So the idea that you can kind of just swim between the islands, or be washed along, has been positive, but you really can't. Apart from sharks, saltwater crocs,
Right.
jellyfish, all the other risks that we know. That's a dangerous stretch of sea. To then factor in that we have intense currents flowing through, pulling you out into the Indian Ocean, right? So the idea that you can just, swim across is out. You have to travel at one point about 100 miles at sea, right? So you need really to be on some kind of watercraft, right?
Yeah, and even
Now,
if they were able to cross the Wallace line, I mean, there's the Timor Straits, which is absolutely also a formidable patch of stretch of ocean as well. And
absolutely.
so Homo erectus, then the implication is they had watercraft that was not just like a raft, but I mean they were capable of crossing this line. And do you
Yeah.
think that is sort of like an ancestral technology that these that the people their direct ancestors were privy to? I guess they were using, and perhaps do you think they were using that to cross? Because back then, the sea level was a lot lower, right? Especially during the Ice Age. So I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's risen and fallen a couple of times, but yeah, I mean, we're assuming that during most of these movements would be at times when, the sea levels were, more favoring movements.
right. So according to the mainstream, people weren't using boats until very, very recent, like 4,000 something years ago, right? So this totally throws a monkey wrench into that.
Yeah, and I'm wary as well when we say boats. I mean, we're probably dealing when we say we have to particularly say watercraft because
Yes.
watercraft is much simpler.
Right,
You know,
right.
like possibly like a raft, made out of bamboo lashed together with vines. As a simple watercraft, right?
Hmm.
So that is something we can readily imagine. Early hominins figuring out, right? Because
Yes.
if you see bamboo floating in rivers, which if you're in Southeast Asia, you're going to see, right? You're going to see that regularly. And in fact, a child's natural thing is to. I mean, I've played on those when I've been in Trinidad, as where my family are from, playing on the bamboo, and
Right.
using that as a floating aid, right? So it doesn't take a huge leap to think, well, 5 pieces floats me better than 2 pieces, etc., right? And then you also used to vines. There's vines everywhere in those jungles, right? There's vines everywhere.
Yes.
So it doesn't take a huge leap for somebody to figure out, I can tie the vine round these bamboo sticks
Right.
and make something that I can float on better, right? So we're not talking about a boat, with oars and sails and stuff.
Hmm.
So that probably does come much, much later. But
Hmm.
I think that we can certainly allow for the idea that someone could lash some some vines around some bamboo
Right.
sticks, right?
Absolutely.
And that's sufficient. You can use that to cross between islands in Southeast Asia with trouble. I don't think it'd be easy even with that, but obviously it becomes viable. Because you can carry some water, you can carry some food on your little raft, and you can potentially, I suppose, whether you're swimming it along or if you do, but I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speculate too much as to sails, but, or oars, but obviously it's possible that you use some kind of stick or something as an oar to move yourself along. But either way, you're starting to deal with the problem of how do you cross between islands, right, in a fairly simple way. Other arguments we put in that perhaps some people were washed off of an island by a tsunami and carried between these islands. But I mean, that's to me is nonsensical, right? Because first of all, we've all seen the effects of a serious tsunami. I mean, you've got to survive, and yes, some people survive in the water and are washed out to sea. So you're now at sea. You've got no raft, nothing. You may be lucky enough to have a log floating or something, but then the water doesn't carry you towards the island. And this is another problem that no one seems to tackle, is that a tsunami at sea doesn't really carry you. It just passes beneath you, right? That you would just feel a slight, bobbing in the water as it passes. The tsunami really only manifests when it hits land. Yeah, it's of no particular use for carrying you between islands. Now, the second problem you have there is that you need a whole population, right,
Yes.
to have been swept out and all successfully made it to the island at the same time. They have to arrive at the same time, so you have breeding pairs to establish a population. Now, is it likely that, say, 100 people are washed out, all get lucky enough to get logs, and are all able to somehow paddle, in the right direction and end up on Flores? So it's, you start getting into this really fanciful way of trying to say we're not allowing them watercraft. That they can't have had them. Whereas it's much simpler to say they figured out watercraft. It's the thing that makes sense for what we're seeing in the data, right?
Right.
So if we give them that, if you've crossed Wallace's line and you've gone through, several islands already, you've done the hard part. All you have left is one more stretch of water, and you reach the huge coastlines of Australia. Yeah, you've done all the hard work.
Yeah.
Now, it's generally been assumed that there were no humans there until about 60,000 years ago or so. Now it's gone up over the last few years. From
Right.
If you go back a couple of decades, it goes back to about 30,000 or 20,000 years, and they've had to keep pushing that date back.
Yes.
Right. But now we're up to about 50, 60,000, with other studies coming up which are going to suggest 120,000.
Yeah, like rock shelters. There's like a 55,000-year-old rock shelter in Australia, and that's pushing it back. And yeah.
Yeah, in the north, we've got the 65,000 to 65 to 80,000-year-old shelter, but up in the north in Arnhem Land, right? And the dating there is considered conservative by some of the sort of the thermoluminescence experts, saying that they've been very conservative. That 80,000 plus is probably supportable from what they've seen. But also there's evidence of early fire stick farming at several sites, including Lake George and also at the Great Barrier Reef. They found core sampling, which suggests that there was deliberate burning, the traditional Aboriginal practice of deliberate burning, that it was underway 120,000 years ago, right? So that pushes it. That's, I think, is going to push it back. We're going to see that quite soon anyway. but apart from that, we have this huge gap, right?
Yes.
That there's hominins in Flores, there's hominins all throughout these islands, but none of them reach Australia, even though they've crossed Wallace's line. Now, this is a huge glaring anomaly because if you've come that far, there's nothing to stop you now hitting the coastline, even if it's by accident, even if someone on their raft is washed along. There's a good chance at that point someone's going to end up on the north coast of Australia, right?
Yes.
So I infer that we have to start being a bit logical here and saying the absence of the evidence isn't evidence of absence, rather that we have the problem there's been huge sea level rises and we've lost the northern coastline, right?
Yes.
So if we still had that coastline, I suspect we would see some very, very ancient sites dotted around, right? Now, with ocean, exploration, we may still find some evidence, but not many people want to get into that, ocean archaeology business. It's expensive, it's difficult. You've got to say it's a huge Australian coastline, where to start looking,
Yes.
right? So I don't know if that's going to happen. But the rational thing is to say that probably if 1 million years ago hominins were on Flores, let's say within 100, let's be really generous, within 100,000 years, someone's going to hit the Australian coastline. Someone.
Yes.
Right? Because it becomes nonsensical to think that they wouldn't. Having seen them, they've now crossed all of these islands of Indonesia. So if you say, why would they? Well, why would they cross the islands of Indonesia? So these people are moving around.
Yeah, it seems like they're being underestimated, their abilities, their curiosity. They're all human.
Very much so.
Yeah.
They are human, yeah, and they're exploiting your resources. Maybe an island runs out of resources, they move on, right? And so where do you move on to next? Well, there's a vast continent just to your south, So I think that we had people there very early. Now, this is where, obviously, I differ from recent out of Africa in general. I say that these hominins reached Australia probably around 900,000 years ago. But the interesting thing is we don't really see the split between other archaic hominins and the ancestors of Homo sapiens till around 750, 800,000 years ago. So that's beyond my generous limit there,
right,
that they only need to have separated off 900,000, 800,000 years ago to be in the right place for things to be happening there rather than Africa. Now, interestingly, from a very consensus kind of point of view, we know that species divergence is often encouraged by either cataclysms or other things that cause bottlenecks,
yes,
right? And so one of the things that causes a bottleneck, of course, is a small group reaching a huge continent, and being trapped there in some respect, and then taking advantage of those resources. We also know evolution is driven partly by new environments. We've got an entirely new environment with unique species by absolutely vast numbers. And we've got, of course, the marsupials, and so totally unique species, a unique and vast landmass. Now, if you imagine a small population of early hominins reach it, they're going to experience accelerated evolution merely by reaching the place, right? And then, of course, now you've got a bottleneck, and so you start to have things happen at the genetic level which encourage speciation, right?
Yes.
So in those, and I know it was Michio Kaku who spoke on this, and he said, he would have expected something, to happen to early humans reaching Australia for those very same reasons. So it's not something that, I'm alone in thinking this. There are other very genius minds out there have pondered that and thought, it makes a lot of sense that the pressures on you there are very different, and that would encourage change, right? So if we then imagine that we have this underway, this change, around 700,000 years ago, and now that there's movements in that area, as we find these early hominins in the Philippines, we don't know they've got remains, but they've got cut marks and whatnot on bones. It seems, again, people are moving around at that time, which is after the point where we started to emerge. So I'm suspecting these are early ancestral Homo sapiens, if you like.
Yes.
Depends what you want to call them.
Or the
I
Hobbit
should
people.
clarify here.
The Hobbit
Sorry,
people,
yeah.
Homo luzinensis, yeah.
Look at how they're finding all of these different hominins throughout the Indonesian islands and the Philippines, right? Where once it was thought nothing much was going on, now we have evidence of several, unique Homo species, and possibly, the Floresiensis. They've even thought maybe the ancestors of those were an early Australopithecine due to the small stature.
Yes.
It suggests that they're not coming from Homo erectus, but something even earlier, right? Now that's interesting because if, let's say, an Australopithecine has managed to make its way down to Flores and then it hits Australia, it may be that all Homo have emerged in that region and that they've radiated back out, and that the base clade of Homo may be even down there. We don't know. But if Australopithecines are ranging the world, millions of years, let's say 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, who knows, years ago, right? I mean, recently they found evidence, I think, up in somewhere in the Middle East of early sites 2.5 million years old, right? Which they've
Yes.
suggested it's like hominin sites, right? So if we've got these Australopithecines, some sort, or perhaps it's a very early Homo that's outranging the world at that time, that really, really, really makes you think, why are we limiting the story to Africa, right?
That
Because
is very
it,
interesting.
it is interesting because, and again, this is why I take a bit of a multi-regional view. I think, yes, things probably are changing in Africa too, but we can't just discount all of these hominins that are everywhere else and just assume, well, they didn't play any part in the story. It's like, well, we really don't have any evidence to just lock them out in that way, because we don't have the genetic data or anything that would really say that these are completely unrelated hominins, right? Because we haven't been able to extract DNA from, from anyone that early. I mean, the earliest we have is the Semidolus huesos hominins in Spain, which go back, I think it's 430,000 years or something, like the DNA, right? So that's the earliest DNA we have. So anyone who sort of thinks, well, DNA has solved it all. Well, no, because we don't have any that's a million years old. We're not extracting it from these really early hominins. So I think that's, not to sideline, but that's another point. I think a lot of people assume that we have DNA from the beginning of this story, because you hear people say that, well, the DNA proves that we came from Africa. Right, that's a very bold statement to make.
Well,
right?
isn't there faulty evidence that they're working with there? Because isn't the genetic sample out of Africa that they're working with only like 5,000 years old? It's really young, right, compared to everything
Very young.
else.
Yeah, the oldest. In fact, the studies that were done that established out of Africa were on modern DNA.
Yes.
They were modern. They were people like myself of African descent. Modern African descent. Now, people have to say it's a huge leap to assume that the ancestors of modern Africans were always in Africa, right? That's a huge assumption.
That's a huge
baseless assumption.
Yes.
Right, because we are not giant redwoods. Yeah.
Right.
A giant redwood forest, will slowly creep along, right, in its region, and you can pretty much say, well, we know that the ancestor of this redwood is that one, 20 miles that way, these fossil finds, that's the ancestors, this is that forest, an ancestral forest, because that's how, trees spread, right? But we are humans, we walk around, we go vast distances, even in one lifetime, if I want to, I can walk across the whole of Eurasia in my lifetime.
Oh, there are YouTube
right?
videos of people doing that. Yeah.
Absolutely. People have walked around the world.
Yeah.
So the assumption that my African ancestors were always in Africa is really, really flimsy. Yeah. And then we keep seeing that status as a fact. Now, this one of the things that really gets me is when people say, the DNA proves we have African origins, because most of people don't even know that we don't have any ancient African DNA on file. Right. When I say ancient, not truly, truly ancient. Now, the oldest they found so far is down in the southern part, around 5,000 years old. Right up in the north, I think up in Morocco, they have some that's about 12,000 years old. So that's the absolute oldest ever found in Africa. Now, 12,000 years ago has nothing to do with the beginnings of modern humans. Nothing at all. Right? So we have no DNA from the beginning of that. And even the Semidolus huesos DNA is not from an ancestor of modern humans. So we've established that. That population, as far as we know, played no role in us, right?
Yes.
The actual oldest, I think, is a sample about 45,000 years old from, I think it's from Romania, I think, or something. We got, is it Ushtish Jim? The guy, I can't remember pronounce it, but basically, about 45,000-year-old DNA, right, from a modern human, the earliest modern human DNA, and that's in Eurasia. So that doesn't help place us in Africa at all, right?
No.
So these are huge issues. So when someone says, the DNA proves it, what they're really meaning is, if you assume that the ancestors of the sub-equatorial Africans had always been in Africa, and then you assume that they're the only ancestral population of other modern humans. If you allow those assumptions, then you can say, well, our DNA seems to go back to them. Again, you have to also take an assumption that haplogroup L3, emerged there and wasn't brought into the country, which, we'll tackle. So there's a flow of assumptions, each one of which is easily questioned, right? So this idea of certainty and that the DNA proves it is so frustrating because it's so untrue.
So this leads me to my next question about why lineages that came from supposedly Africa and were later replaced by either East Asians or these Australasian people. Could you tell us a little bit more about that why lineage replacement?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have this look, so if we go back to, look, I accept that I think Homo, again, I know tacked a little bit, that I think the ancestors of Homo sapiens were widespread from 700,000 years ago, right? So if you just assume for a moment, say, okay, there's no particular barriers, right? Every now and again, seas move, ice changes and whatnot, but there's essentially no barriers between Africa, Europe, right? And then obviously America has barriers at times. You have ice formations and whatnot that stop you crossing, and Beringia. Australia, again, we know sea level rises sometimes favor crossings through the islands and whatnot. But we know people were moving around there a million years ago. So, okay, so there's been no particular barrier to hominins between Australasia, Eurasia, and Africa for a million years. Okay, so there's no particular reason why we shouldn't assume that from 700,000 years ago, as our ancestral lines were moving around, that they weren't everywhere, right?
Right.
So if you go with that as being like on my side an assumption, and bear in mind I've just listed a whole lot of assumptions on the opposing side of this, so I think it's not unfair for me to say, well, I'm going to take one assumption here. And we have evidence. We know there's hominin fossils all across the region that are suggesting this anyway. And so you have these populations. That means that we have a flow of genes, right?
Yes.
So you have gene flow between different regions. There's no particular reason why not. We know, again, we've established that at all times that we know of, hominins have been mixing between different populations. Found no particular barrier for that, okay? Neanderthals, Denisovans, us, we all did it. If we go back further, we can be pretty sure that all homos at any given time in history, if they encountered each other, they interbred. They saw each other as being the same species. There's no evidence to suggest otherwise, right? So with this gene flow going on, you're going to have had early Homo sapiens ancestors in Africa as well as outside of Africa. Now, what I think happened is that, yes, we have probably the emergence of possibly haplogroup L in Africa and beyond, that it's emerging in a large connected population, but that every now and again we have cataclysmic events, right, which will remove certain populations and temporarily block areas and will inhibit gene flow. And so you will see that happen every now and again. Now, I think that one of these events, a particularly important one, occurs around about 100 we've probably had a couple. I know around 120,000 years ago, there's a period of movements where around that time there seems to be some bottlenecks. But again, of course, we have this huge event 74,000 years ago, which would have, Lake Toba supervolcano, the biggest eruption of the last couple of million years, kicks off right down in Indonesia. Now the smoke, the gas cloud, all the ash, it travels towards the northwest. It doesn't hugely impact the islands to the east or Australia, as far as we know, right? The evidence suggests it all travels towards the northwest. The smoke circles the globe around the northern hemisphere, adding to cooling, which is already in effect. In fact, this is occurring as we are heading back into a colder period. Now, this dust would have accelerated the existing cooling in the northern hemisphere, making it a really intense time. And on top of that, you've got things, acid rain, poisoning of water, obviously dying plants due to lack of photosynthesis, huge pressure being put on life, because of course, as small animals die off, they can't eat, the larger ones die off. Obviously, humans that are dependent on all of these resources are put under enormous pressure. Now, that leaves two potential refuges, one being down in sub-equatorial Africa, because we know that south of the equator, right. Yeah, because we know south of the equator there wasn't any huge impact. Recent studies have shown that there wasn't a huge impact on sub-equatorial Africa, and also down in south of the equator in Asia. So if you can get down into Australia and some of the other islands, perhaps, then you were essentially isolated from the effects. But what happens to all those hominins up in the north, right? I think that there would have been an enormous die-off. Now, it doesn't mean it's a complete extinction, but an enormous die-off, which is now severing the link, the gene flow between regions.
Yes.
And funnily enough, right at that time, it turns out that we have the divergence in the DNA of Aboriginal people and sub-equatorial Africans. Right? They found out it was in a hair that was sampled, and it showed that it's going back a few years now, not too many, 3-4 years. And they tested a hair, and they found, and it suggested that the DNA, divergence began around about 73,000 years ago. Now, isn't that interesting? It happens to begin right around the time of Lake Toba. Right. That's when Africans and Oceanians begin to separate at the DNA level, right? And this is the moment when I believe that gene flow between regions was severed. Right? And before that, you had a fairly homogeneous population spread across regions, okay?
Right.
With always gene flow going both ways, all directions, because we're chaotic. We're like water particles in a glass. We're moving around everywhere. That's what humans are like, if you've got
Right.
enough of us, right? So it was chaotic, but the gene flow is going around everywhere. Until then, it severs it. Now, that left, we had in Africa, the haplogroups we had there was L1, L2, L4, L5, L6. And just outside of Africa, in Western Eurasia, I believe we had L3. Now, with the pressure that's put on these populations in Western Asia, that they begin to try to move away from this cataclysm, and some of them crossed into Africa across the Bab el-Mandab Straits,
Yes.
which are basically down by Yemen, and they've crossed into East Africa. Funnily enough, where we find remains such as Homo and Herto and these early Homo sapiens or very early modern humans, right there. That's where we find them. Right, that this is the area where I believe they were crossing in and out of Africa. Right, so this is a known pathway, and then we have people pressured into the continent, and as they come in, we see the emergence in modern African genomes. We see the emergence of these new haplogroups,
Yes.
L3 on the mitochondrial line, and on the Y chromosome we have CT, which also appears at the same time. Now, I also point out in the book that the mutation rates for the Y chromosomes and mtDNA are different by a factor of 10. So the chances of a mutation event occurring right in both lines at the same time, in the same place, in the same small population is ridiculous. Like, you get your lottery ticket, right? Because you're on those sort of odds. You're now saying that you've got unprecedented mutations going on in a small population, right? And you have also then the appearance of haplogroups, the MT haplogroups, M and N, which are dated to approximately the same time. So you're now saying that this same population, who supposedly then leaves Africa almost immediately after the appearance of L3 and CT, leaves Africa, and immediately there's further mutations leading to both the haplogroups M and N. Now, this is getting into some ludicrous territory, right? Because we're now suggesting about 5 unique mutations in this small population for no particular reason, which are defying the odds in every sense.
Yes.
Right? This doesn't make sense. What makes sense is a population moving inwards. And when we see the map of haplogroup L3, it expands westward and southward into Africa,
Yes.
right? Not out of Africa. It actually moves inwards. And this meshes very well with climate refugees crossing the Bab el-Mandab, fleeing from the cataclysm that's behind them. We also see the appearance of ranged weapons, the first, like spear points and arrow point looking points that are found in the region dating to the same period. So we can also infer that these were not people that they could have pushed back, right? Because if they have ranged weapons and you don't, right, you're on the losing team.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So there's only 2 ways you deal with that. You either run and surrender, or you welcome them in.
Yes.
So we don't know which, but we certainly know that interbreeding occurs, and we see the flow of those genes. Now, whether that's, it'd be nice to think they were welcomed in, but who knows, right? But certainly they had the upper hand in terms of the weapons, and you can imagine with hell at their back, they are not turning round. So there would have been no stopping these people, and that's just what we see, right? So
Yes.
on the top of that, then we now have the African population is essentially enclosed because there's an enormous drought which begins around the same time. And indeed, all of northern Africa, the Middle East, the Levant, plunges into some of the most arid conditions, in the last sort of million years.
Yeah.
Absolute, catastrophic. And as one sort of climate expert has said, this would have been, a terribly unwise time for humans to try to walk out of Africa. That's ironic because this is exactly the time we're told that they did do it.
Yeah.
Right? So that is what we see with these in terms of the L3 movement, is that what I really think we're seeing here is part of a larger expansive population that carried L3 in Eurasia and also carried M and N haplogroups in Eurasia. And what we see is at the end of this, we see that I think the M and N carrying people are mostly then confined down towards Australasia, right?
Yes.
And the L3 group makes their way into Africa, so that we have this split. But they're very closely related. We know this. They say that's why they assume that L3, M, and N probably emerged in the same event around the same time, i.e., the same population. If you take it the other way, they're most likely the same people, right? That a singular population, but it's been devastated, and survivors of one lot are on one side and survivors on the other side. But they're so closely related that it's bizarre to see it as any other way, other than to say that, that there's all these random mutations occurring in a tiny population, right? And then going against all the odds, these people go through, a barren hellscape, out into this absolute horrific, territory that they'd have to cross to get into Eurasia for no reason, because there's nothing there. There's a terrible ice age is unfolding.
Yes.
Right. So why are they going there? They're in sort of, it'd be a paradise compared to where they're going. Why would you keep going? Why not turn back, right? Because you'd start to see that there was no water, that the plants were dying. It's like, I don't think this is working out.
Right.
Time to turn around. Because again, these were humans, modern humans. Yeah. And we know how modern humans think because we are modern humans.
Yes.
When things start getting terrible ahead of you, you turn back, right? You don't just keep going. It doesn't make any sense. So there's been some strange leaps in it. Again, a lot of this has changed very recently. So when people say, how did we ever end up with recent out of Africa? Well, the truth is we didn't have these climate models before. Well, we didn't have the depth of the genomic knowledge. On top of that, we didn't really have any finds of modern human fossils beyond Africa. So, I mean, it was quite limiting.
Yes.
Right? And I totally understand that. If you go back to the 80s, you'd say, well, where do we have these other people? We don't really have them. We just have signs of modern humans in Africa. It makes sense that we now see in the genome of modern Africans, we see this, these haplogroups at L3, and it's so close to MNN, which is like the basal Eurasian haplogroups. You can definitely see like how that model came about, right?
Yes.
But the problem is no one seems to be adapting to the changed territory, in that we now see there's lots of modern human fossils and Homo sapiens fossils external to Africa, that we've got them in China, several caves with teeth of fully modern human teeth, right? They go back to 80 to 120,000 years. Down in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, you've got sites at about 60 to 73,000. Even Laos, I think 50 to 60,000. Obviously now Aboriginal Australia, sites we assume to be modern humans, 65 to 80,000. The Levant region, over 100,000, 200,000. Got Greece now, 230,000. Right. So this is absolutely a collapsed model, right? In my view, collapsed. But it's a walking dead, the zombie that no one's putting it down yet, because there's so many holes in it.
Do you think that's by design? Do you think there's a reason why they're not accepting all the new data, all these new puzzle pieces of this jigsaw puzzle of human origins? Do you think there's like some sort of vested interest in keeping that truth from coming out, or do you think it's just people are just stubborn and want to be right?
Yeah, I mean, I say there's definitely vested. There's no doubt there's vested interest. There's no doubt that there's professors who have to go in lecturing their students who'd have to say, everything I've taught you was wrong. It was rubbish. That book I just released, it needs to go in the shredder, right? So humans are, we are what we are, and that people will consider their vested interests. Okay. Now, doesn't mean all scientists, but there are people who have obviously built up quite big egos in this subject. And
Egyptology comes to mind.
Yeah, the Egyptologists are like that. They're very stuck in the idea that you can only have copper tools. It doesn't matter what evidence. You can show them all the drill holes that you want. That it's no, it's all copper tools cutting through granite, and that there's no flexibility, right? So we definitely see that, but also academia moves kind of slow. A new study that has to go to a paper, that has to go through peer review, and before anyone will then say, yep, we've proved it now. So there is a degree of that. I can probably move faster than an academic, and again, who would be under more heavy fire from his community if he just came out and said, the emperor's got no clothes, that they're going to say, how dare you say that? You better prove that in a peer-reviewed study with 20 other high-standing academics, or else, your career will be ruined. So they have different pressures to me. Like, I can totally understand that. But yeah, there's definitely vested interest. I mean, like, so I've had, issues where I've talked to, well, look, one very clear issue. I had an article published in Forbes, right, obviously a major media platform, by an award-winning scientist who has a background in anthropology as well, and he's a biologist and whatnot. So, you'd think he's the guy that, Forbes journalist, that if he says it's worth discussing something, it's worth discussing it. They accept his other articles, right? That he published an article about my work. It was put on the website. It was live. And then within a few hours, a complaint had been made, somebody more senior, and it had been pulled off and was just censored without any explanation to the readers. Nothing saying we've removed this article because such and such. And as one anthropologist said to me, it's offensive almost to the readers, because if you've decided it was good enough for them to see, then you should explain why you decide now it's not good enough for them to see. He said at the very least they should put a retracting statement as to why we've removed this story, right? And he said instead it was just nothing. And then they told the journalist that they shouldn't use me as a source because I'm not a professional anthropologist. Like he said, that's not the basis for having a real idea. Right? You have to be, have to have a PhD. There's nothing in the world of science saying that you have to have a PhD. Because look, we know that science is not built on the backs of people that had PhDs, right? Because that's a fairly modern idea. If we go back, there's been amazing discoveries made by people who had no qualifications, right? Which helped found the disciplines of science. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the idea that you have to have a PhD to write an article, or have an article even written about you by a professional scientist who has got his qualifications, right, is ludicrous. So that is censorship. Mm-hmm. And that is because there's vested interest. There's no other way of looking at that. And in fact, again, I've spoken to quite a well-known anthropologist who's sort of a debunker of pseudoscience. Mm-hmm. Even in his view, he was saying, well, I almost suspect it could be people I know from my university that might have done that. And so he gives you an idea that he knows there's people with that kind of thinking that would have potentially gone in and asked for that to be removed. Now, it's also suspicious that Forbes, shortly after that, hired about 3 of the best-known scientific skeptics of pseudoscience, who all suddenly were writers for Forbes Science, right? Yes. So I wonder who the people were that put in the complaint. And probably said, you need us on there to stop any pseudoscience, right? So people can go on there and have a look themselves who they're anthropologists they have on their writing. And those are the most likely people to have censored my work, right? But anyway, so I know that there's vested interest. And I know that there's people doing stuff like that. I've also contacted a leading paleoanthropologist and said, would you be interested to read my book? He's like, oh, I've heard of your book. And I'm thinking, well, look, if you've heard of it, then you've all heard of it, right?
Yeah.
Because, if you've got leading people and they've already heard about it, then there's obviously been discussions about my work. I've seen articles come out since I put the book out which mirror my work. I don't know if they plagiarized it or if they just happened to have the same thoughts, months after me. It's very hard to prove that, but I've had other scientists again say to me, look, they probably have stolen your work. They're never going to admit it, not to their dying day. Sorry, their dying day, where they say, we took work from him, because he's a kook. So there's no way they're ever going to admit it, but probably they did steal your work, right? So these things are happening. Right. And people can look at the evidence trail for it. If they read the book and they look at news stories that came out afterwards about the Denisovans and about Homo erectus possibly speaking and traveling, on boats through Southeast Asia, those things came out in news stories after I published. Right. So and indeed, I'm the first person to suggest the Denisovan homeland was in Papua. Right. Which now is becoming a fairly accepted position.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So again, I think that's not to labour the point, but I think that there's definitely a mix in there of the slow movement of science and vested interest.
Absolutely. There's one other topic that I wanted to discuss before we end the interview, and that is your that is the Into America theory. And this centers around Clovis technology, which is thought to be the oldest technology in North America, versus Solutrean technology and their similarities. Could you speak on that a little bit and kind of for our audience, just lay out the basics for that type of theory, that Solutrean technology Into America theory?
Yeah, I mean, the Solutreans, these a very early European population.
Cro-Magnon, right?
Yeah, there's been an argument that some of the Solutreans made their way to the Americas, perhaps in that sort of 15,000 years ago, and that they may have been the first Americans rather than more Asiatic, Siberian groups that moved across Beringia. So that's been one debate now. But then, we can go back earlier, of course, than that. And as we touched on earlier, that the fact is that it used to be accepted that the first modern humans arrived about 13,000 years ago. And obviously that's sort of collapsed. Now we know that there's layers beneath the Clovis tools where we find other technologies, obviously Solutrean type, but also others. They found recently, they know they're finding tool types that don't mesh, and that there's other, unknown early populations that were in the north, in the north of America, and of course, again, down in the south. Now, the weird thing is you'll still see articles saying, we found one of the earliest sites in the Americas, it's 14,000 years old, or it's 15,000 years old. But then there's sites like Blue Cave, which is
the Bluefish
which
Cave.
is something like 24,000. You go down to indeed
Monte
there's another side in the north. Monte Verde, and we've got down in Brazil these sites where I say the Lagoa Santa are, which again dates of at least 24,000. Some suggestive of, like I say, 30, 40,000, but certainly very well dated at 24,000. There's a site up in North America, I think in Texas or somewhere, where the guy, he was going 50,000-year-old dates.
Yeah.
The layers too, right? So although they keep playing it as though, yeah, we accept Clovis as being overturned, but, and people got there 14 or 15,000 years, it's like, it's still that, you're pulling teeth to get them to move back to the real dates, because, by now it should be universally accepted that the early modern humans, were there way before that. But certainly 24,000 is an absolute minimum. Even if you just go on Blue Cave and some of these sites down in Brazil, that 24,000 is a minimum, an absolute minimum, not 13 or 14,000. And again, I think that we really have to take it back earlier. And obviously, there's controversy around very early sites. We have these mammoth bones that suggest, San Diego, possibly 120, 130,000 years old. Yeah. Which is interesting, because 120, 130,000 years ago is an interesting point in time, because that's when we find these teeth of modern humans in China. This is when we find, as I say, the Aboriginal sites down in Australia. We know that this is an interglacial period, right? Around 115 to 130,000 years ago, with people moving around again, right? It's funny that we have that site on that timeline, right? So again, and there's older than that. There's the sort of notorious site which destroyed many careers, really, that they found at Lake Huatulaco, right, where they had dates that were just crazy dates. They were going back 200, 300, 400,000 years, and they had geologists saying, look, we'll stake our careers on it, that these are the dates, and the archaeologists wouldn't have it. They said that no, that it must be all wrong. It has to be less than 13,000 years. We're not having it, and people's careers were ruined. But now we're having to rethink that, because look, there's no reason why early hominins, Homo erectus or whoever, couldn't have walked over that same land bridge, right, that was accredited to the Clovis people. There's no reason why that they couldn't have done that. And we know they were widespread 2 million years ago, right? They're already ranging about. Now, there is no reason for that. And in fact, there's Homo erectus-like skulls that have been found in parts of South America, I think in Ecuador and Peru and stuff, right? But they've not been gone as far as papers. They've gone been presented at conferences and stuff. So until we get those validated, but I think there's good reasons to suspect that we would have had archaic hominins in the Americas, even if they became extinct, and that then you've got later waves, of early Homo sapiens, as we see elsewhere, that we see the same situation. Wherever humans could go, that they did go, right? And so this is, again, I think the story of the Americas is about to really shift, and we're going to have to revise not only our entrance point, but the point of when the first Homo, arrived there as well.
Absolutely. Just really quick about the Solutreans once again. Just for the audience, if you don't know, the Clovis, they're called fluted points because of the way that they were, these arrowheads were created. They're very, very similar to these early European human technology, which, again, fluted points is evidenced in Western Europe as well. And you think that, please correct me if I'm wrong here, those people in those early EEMHs, I guess, the early European modern humans, they somehow crossed the ocean into the Americas during the last glacial maximum. And during that time, the UK was under a huge ice sheet. I think there was a Doggerland, right? Are you familiar with that? The English Channel wasn't there. So those people during that time, do you believe they were they had a seagoing vessel and they made it in? Is that your line of thinking there?
Well, I mean, that's my line of thinking in a general sense, that we really need to revise the entire idea of how early humans moved about, right?
Right.
Because as soon as you infer that there was watercraft used 700,000 years ago, you've got to rewrite everything. Because there's a lot of assumptions in there. Like if you look at the gap between Morocco and Spain, right, that is not much of a barrier if you've got watercraft.
Right.
Yeah. So suddenly you've got things like, well, we found early Homo sapiens in Morocco 300,000 years ago, right? Did they originate there, or did they sail across from Spain, where we know that we've got hominins ranging about up there? Right. In fact, you've got very early Homo erectus down in the south of Spain, going back 1.5 million years. right? So again, we don't really know. Once you throw in watercraft, all these long, long journeys on the map where if you're walking seem like almost impenetrable barriers, they
Right.
just go away. Even things like simple river crossings
Yeah.
can make the difference between a slow migration over centuries, and 2 days on a boat,
Yeah,
right?
they're like conveyor
And
belts, right? They're not barriers.
yeah,
Yeah.
and people we know. Look, people have been swept across from Africa to South America, like in modern day, small fishing boats. They've been
Yeah.
swept across, right? So we know that you don't need to have any great sailing fleet to make some of these crossings. It happens. People get swept out to sea and they survive, right?
Absolutely.
So we could well have had people certainly moving from Europe into the Americas again, as we could have had people ranging throughout the Indonesian islands. Look, if you think 700,000 years of time for watercraft to improve, at what point do we stumble on boats or even ships? I mean, we really have to rethink this because there's there's a lot of assumptions in there. We know that, for example, down in, I don't, again, tell you too much of your time, but down in Southeast Asia, they now realize there were people doing deep sea fishing around 40 or 50,000 years ago. Deep sea
Wow.
fishing for shark and stuff, right? That takes more than some canoe, little canoe or
You need
something.
like
But
cranes or
catching tuna
something.
and shark, right? So they've got some sort of reasonable boat. There's large hooks. They're pulling in deep sea fish like tuna and whatnot. So if 50,000
Yeah.
years ago you're capable of deep sea fishing, that's a long time to develop from then onto some serious, ocean going vessels, right?
Right.
So I think that we really have to be careful here of the assumptions that, that it's all walking about the place because, there's no reason why people can't move from Western Europe across, towards Africa or onto America or whatever. Once you give them, sensible sized ocean going boats. And like that's, I don't put too big a speculation because you can't find them, right? They're rotted away.
Yeah.
Not going to
Absolutely.
find them. So we have to start inferring them that if we know people have been using watercraft for hundreds of thousands of years, do we really believe that they were so slow at progressing that it's took them all the way up until historical times to have decent ocean-going vessels? Now, knowing our species, that seems to me incredibly unlikely, right?
Right.
That we didn't have something in that time. If we can do ocean fishing 50,000 years ago, or something 40,000 years ago, I'm struggling to see how we hadn't got onto vessels that could carry someone, say, from Europe to America, like 13,000 years ago, right? Because you've
Right.
had thousands of years more time, right? So again, I'm not saying it had to happen that way, but we have to open our minds to where the direction, the evidence is moving.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, we could conclude the interview. But the last thing I'd like to ask you is, I think you're coming down to California, right? You're doing Contact in the Desert this year. Is that, am I understanding that?
That's the plan at the moment. Yeah, all being well, I should be there in the end of May.
Absolutely. End of May. That's, I think, Joshua Tree, California, right? Is it Joshua Tree this year?
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
hopefully, maybe there'll be other events to come up in the US at some point as well. To start doing some presentations there as well, which would be good. Obviously, Europe
Great.
doesn't have the same amount of conferences and whatnot. It tends to be a US based. The interest in many of these topics are heavily US dominated, to be honest.
Absolutely. So could you share with us where people can find more information about you, about your work, and maybe some
Sure.
other dates that they can come see you?
Yeah, sure. If people would like to find me, I have brucefenton.info, ancientnews.net, which is the main website for these topics. Of course, on Amazon, they can find the Into Africa theory, which is the Forgotten Exodus, the Into Africa theory, which is sort of forward by Graham Hancock as well, which is glowing forward, which I appreciated. And yeah, they can find me on Facebook and contact me there. And if they have any tips or questions, my email is bruce@ancientnews.net. So should they be interested in that? And other events I will update on my Facebook, my website, so they can keep an eye on me there.
Absolutely. All right, Bruce. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. Hopefully, we will be in touch later on down the road because there's still so many things I want to talk to you about because you seem to be an encyclopedia of all of this stuff. So, yeah, thank you so much, and we'll be in
Thanks, Ian.
touch. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you having me on.
No
Take
problem.
care.
Take care. Ooh, what a long interview. Whew. Ladies and gentlemen, that was an intense conversation. That went really longer than I thought. Please let me know your thoughts on what was going on what you thought. What any other questions to Bruce in the comments? Please let me know. I will have him on again. He is coming down to my neck of the woods in Joshua Tree, so that is going to be a doozy. So again, let me know what you guys think, and I'll have this uploaded very shortly.